In this video lecture, we'll be looking at the causes of World War II and how events in the late 1930s built up to the beginning of World War II with the invasion of Poland. World War II begins as a result of two basic factors. The first is aggression and the acts of violence that were taken by dictators such as Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and Emperor Hirohito and his Prime Minister Tojo in Japan, as well as how European countries and the United States responded to those actions, which was with a policy of appeasement, which is what these two political cartoons are showing you. In the cartoon on the left here, you can see Hitler kind of marching up a flight of stairs that is made out of bodies of leaders of other countries. And you see the phrase spineless leaders of democracy down here beneath them. This is a commentary on how the leaders of European countries were fearful of Hitler, were concerned about a Second World War beginning if they were to confront Hitler, and how they failed to stand up to Hitler and stop his early actions, which ultimately gave him more strength, more power, and allowed him to begin World War II with the invasion of Poland in 1939. The cartoon on the right is a description of America's attitude towards the rise of Hitler and the dictators in Europe. If you can see from the little phrase here, ho-hum, when he's finished pecking down that last tree, he'll quite likely be tired. America, as well as many of the countries of Europe, failed to respond to the actions of Hitler and Mussolini because they often believed that it would never impact them, that it wouldn't reach them, and since it wasn't going to reach them, it wasn't worth engaging in a conflict that could escalate into a war. As a result of the Great Depression and the destruction of World War I, most European countries were hesitant to engage with Hitler in any way that would provoke a larger conflict. And so that's what appeasement is all about, and what these two political cartoons are showing you. The build-up to World War II begins with German aggression. As Hitler began to ignore the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, he took two major actions. The first was rebuilding the German military, which he started in 1936, and which was a violation of the Treaty of Versailles that Germany had signed after World War I. And then once he had rebuilt his military, he sent the troops into the demilitarized land known as the Rhineland, which was the border between France and Germany that had been given to France in the Treaty of Versailles. And so in 1936, Hitler starts to ignore that treaty, and the democratic countries of Europe respond with a policy of appeasement, as I just explained. What appeasement refers to is the act of giving into an aggressor or letting them take aggressive action in the hope that that will prevent a future conflict. That if you don't engage, if you don't get involved, if you ignore them, then the aggressor will eventually stop and the conflict will be over. And so what we see is that Europeans develop this strategy of appeasement because they are afraid of escalating the conflict with Hitler into another world war, and most of them thought that Hitler would stop with small territorial gains and increases to the size of Germany. But what ultimately happens is that in 1937, when Hitler sees that no one is willing to stand up to him and that he can ignore certain parts of the Treaty of Versailles, he withdraws completely from the treaty and begins to act as if World War I had never happened, as the Treaty of Versailles did not exist, and that he did not have to follow any of the rules that Germany had agreed to in the treaty regarding the size of their military or acting aggressively towards other countries. Shortly before and during Hitler's acts of aggression, other dictators around the world engaged in similar actions. In the country of Japan, Emperor Hirohito and Prime Minister Tojo made the decision to invade and conquer Manchuria, which was this red area here that is in northeastern China and southeastern Russia. Manchuria was its own independent territory at this time, and Japan chose to invade it. And when people spoke out against Japan for the invasion of Manchuria, they responded by withdrawing themselves from the League of Nations and leaving that agreement, similar to what Hitler did with the Treaty of Versailles. Japan also at this time was increasing the size of its navy, which was a violation of the five-power naval treaty that Japan had signed with the United States and England and France at the conclusion of World War I in 1921. So similar to Hitler, we see Japan ignoring previous agreements that it had made as a country, going back on those agreements and rebuilding its military and using it to aggressively acquire land and take land from other countries through invasion and war. The third major acts of aggression in the mid-1930s came out of Italy, where Benito Mussolini began to engage in a policy known as spazio vitale, which, when translated into English, means living space. And Mussolini's approach of spazio vitale was similar to Hitler's actions of Anschluss and his desire to spread German culture throughout Europe. Mussolini is going to focus on the continent of Africa because Italy had a history with North Africa and the eastern coast of Africa going back to the Roman Empire. And Mussolini hoped to spread Italian culture and his form of dictatorship fascism to this area of the world. And so Mussolini would go on to invade and conquer Ethiopia, which is the dark red section of the Horn of Africa here. And after conquering Ethiopia and claiming it as an Italian colony, he then focused on North Africa and the country of present-day Libya, where he would engage in the first genocide of World War II and the use of chemical weapons, two things that were a violation of the 1925 Geneva Protocol that had been agreed to after World War I, hoping to limit the use of certain weapons and make war more civilized to protect soldiers. So again, in this instance, we see one of the European dictators, again, violating international agreements, refusing to live up to agreements that Italy had committed to before they came to power, and ignoring those agreements for their own personal benefit. And this is where we really see the failure of the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. Since the United States did not join the League of Nations, and since the United Nations or the League of Nations did not have enough power to hold the alliance together and actually enforce consequences on leaders like Hitler and Mussolini, there was no one there to check them. There was no one there to hold them accountable for these actions, and that allowed their acts of aggression to continue and left the responsibility of responding to their acts up to individual countries. And so this is where the ideas of appeasement and neutrality come in. The two most powerful countries in Europe following World War I were Britain and France. And both Britain and France were fearful of Hitler. They wanted to avoid confrontation with Hitler at all costs because of the potential damages and problems that could come out of it. Britain and France had four major reasons for wanting to avoid confrontation. The first, as you see there, is that they were fearful of the idea of communism and didn't want communism to spread throughout Europe. And so in some ways, they actually saw Hitler and his rise to power in Germany as a good thing, and that Hitler would provide a strong defense against the spread of communism and the ideas that Joseph Stalin was pushing in Russia after the Russian Revolution. Britain and France also believed that Hitler would stop after minor gains in territory, that if they allowed him to take small pieces of land like the Rhineland and regain territory that had been part of Germany before World War I, that he would be satisfied with that and that that would stop future acts of aggression. So, the first 2 points there deal with how they viewed Hitler. The other 2 points here, number 3 and 4, deal with the reality of life in those countries. Both Britain and France were still struggling to recover and pull themselves out of the Great Depression, and that exhausted a lot of their financial resources, their military resources, and they simply weren't prepared for a large conflict or war with Germany. And because of the destruction that occurred on the Western Front and with the bombing of London and other cities during World War I, many of the people in those countries had adopted the idea of pacifism, or pursuing peace and avoiding war to prevent destruction and damage to their countries. So, the general attitude of the two countries that could have stood up to Hitler and Mussolini, that could have attempted to stop them, was that it simply wasn't worth engaging in that confrontation, because what Hitler was doing early on in 1936 and 1937 didn't rise to the level that was worthy of starting a war. While Britain and France were avoiding war, the United States made a purposeful choice not to become involved in the events that were going on in Europe. America viewed itself as separate from Europe, as depicted in this political cartoon here, where the United States is shown laying in a separate bed from the countries of Europe. And many Americans believed that the problems that were developing in Europe, the rise of dictators like Hitler and Stalin, the development of Nazism and fascism, these forms of dictatorship that were developing. Many Americans believe that those were diseases or illnesses or problems that would never reach the shores of America as long as we stayed out of the events that were going on. And so America's response to what was going on was designed to prevent any American involvement in a conflict that would, break out in Europe. And so what we did was pass a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts, which outlawed or made certain actions illegal based on the idea that those actions would draw the country into war. So the three biggest examples you see there, we'd made it illegal for American companies and weapons manufacturers to sell weapons to any country that was at war or currently engaged in a conflict with another country anywhere in the world. We made it illegal to loan money to countries who were at war. So we couldn't even support them financially and give them loans that they could use to buy weapons or war supplies, because that had drawn us in World War I. And then because of the unrestricted submarine warfare and the torpedoing of ships like the Lusitania that drew us into World War I, America basically declared a policy that we were not going to defend European ships or risk the country's neutrality to protect Americans who were traveling overseas to European countries. If those Americans were on American ships, that would be different. There were certain things done to protect them, but we were not going to risk our country's security to protect any European ships like we had done in World War I. So, Britain and France are trying to avoid war. They're hesitant. They're timid to respond to Hitler and Mussolini. And the United States basically refused to respond. Even though we could have stepped in and supported Britain and France and worked collectively to address the rise of fascism and Nazism and these acts of aggression, we chose not to, which helps to escalate the situation and leads to future acts of aggression. Once Hitler realized that, the countries who were capable of standing up to him and trying to prevent him from taking acts of aggression were either unwilling or unable to respond, he began to escalate the situation and commit further acts of aggression. In 1938, he embarked on the German policy of Anschluss, which was designed to unite or unify the countries of Austria and Germany and bring them together and make them one territory. And so in 1938, Hitler invades Austria. He takes control of Austria. The people of Austria do not really resist this in any significant way. And the democracies of Europe, Britain and France, do not actually respond to it. They ignore it as if it hadn't happened, and that they were unwilling to get involved in the conflict. And so when Hitler takes Austria without a response, he moves on to the next step of his expansion, which was the Czech crisis that occurred in September 1938. In the Czech crisis, Hitler invaded the Sudetenland, which is this dark brown or dark gold area here on the border between Germany and Czechoslovakia. So that's the area right here on our larger map of Europe. This border area was similar to the Rhineland. It was an area of important resources that were valuable to Germany and provided the border between these two countries of Germany and Czechoslovakia. And so when Hitler invades the Sudetenland, this is the first time anyone attempts to respond to him. The Prime Minister of England goes to Czechoslovakia, and they engage Hitler in some peace negotiations, at which point Hitler agrees that if the Czech Republic gives him the Sudetenland and allows him to claim this land for Germany, he would stop his efforts at expansion and would not invade any other countries. So that agreement was made. Hitler gains control of the Sudetenland in another act of appeasement. They gave in to Hitler, they gave him what he wanted, and they hoped that that would stop things and that he would live up to his word. Ultimately, he's not going to do that and will invade Poland in 1939, as well as invade and take over all of Czechoslovakia. The third major action of aggression taken by Hitler in 1938 was the event called Kristallnacht, which was the Night of Broken Glass, where Nazis began their first major attacks on Jewish people in Germany. In these attacks on the evening of Kristallnacht, close to 100 Jews were killed in Germany, hundreds more were injured, and a large number of Jewish homes and businesses and synagogues were attacked and destroyed in acts of anti-Semitism. And this was the first instance where Hitler directly targeted Jews for violence during the build-up to World War II, and that would lead us down the path towards the larger persecution of Jews in Germany and the Holocaust, which ultimately results in the murder of 6 million Jewish people in concentration camps throughout Europe. So, again, you can see the progression here as each act of aggression is left to itself and is not responded to. Hitler became more empowered and took things a step further with another act of violence. And as these acts of violence occurred, Hitler would make two key alliances to help strengthen him and his efforts even more. The first alliance was the Tripartite Pact, which was agreed to in 1939 but did not become official until 1940. And this agreement united the countries of Germany, Italy, and Japan together and created the alliance known as the Axis powers, which is how we'll refer to Germany, Italy, and Japan during World War II. So this alliance, which had been building because of the similar acts of dictatorship and the relationship between Hitler and Mussolini and Emperor Hirohito in Japan, ultimately becomes a formal alliance shortly after the beginning of World War I, where each one of these nations agrees to defend itself and defend its allies from an attack by another country. The second agreement that Hitler makes is the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which was made between Hitler and Stalin, the leaders of Germany and Russia. This agreement was a surprise to a lot of people because Stalin was promoting communism and the Nazi platform that Hitler was promoting was very anti-communist. But what we see here is an instance where you've got two dictators who have a common goal. Both of them represented relatively strong countries, and they did not want to fight one another. And so they signed the Non Aggression Pact and agreed that they would not fight each other for control of territory in Eastern Europe, and that they would divide the country of Poland evenly between themselves, where Hitler would get the western portion and Russia would get the eastern portion of Poland uh, as territory that could be added to their country. So while this wasn't an alliance where Hitler and Stalin agreed to defend each other and help each other, like the Tripartite Pact, it was an alliance that prevented a conflict and that Hitler hoped would help him avoid a two-front war like Germany had to fight in World War I. Stalin got land out of the deal and got the assurances that he would not have to engage Hitler and that Hitler would not invade Russia like he had invaded Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. And so that agreement was made, and that leads to the start of World War II. Once the Non-Aggression Pact is in place, Germany invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. And 2 days after the invasion of Poland, World War II begins as England and France declare war on Germany in response to their invasion of Poland. England and France had pledged to defend Poland if Hitler invaded. And so when that invasion occurs, England and France honor their promise to Poland and declare war on Germany, which results in Italy and Japan declaring war on Britain and France, and the beginning of World War II. So again, World War II, when we look at it, it comes directly as a result of the rise of dictators and the aggressive acts that they're taking, and the failure of democratic countries to respond to these leaders and step in early on and stop the acts of aggression before they escalated into a full-blown war.